Hey people, it's Nias talking, and this is another Black Heroes videos. And this is from an article from the BBC titled "A Good Man in Rwanda." So this is 20 years ago, Rwanda descended into the madness of genocide. UN peacekeepers were stretched to breaking point, but one stood out, taking huge risks to save hundreds of lives by Mark Doyle. This is the story of the bravest man I've ever met. I've covered many wars and seen many acts of courage, but for sheer grit and determination, I've never known anyone to compare with Captain Mbaye Diagne, a United Nations peacekeeper in Rwanda. I was there in 1994 when 800,000 people were killed in 100 days, and I returned to reconstruct the story of this remarkable, charismatic officer from the West African state of Senegal. The country plunged into war and genocide on 6 April 1994, and remember, this is just one of many ma'afas carried out against the black population of the world. The country plunged into war and genocide on 6th of April 1994 when the plane carried the Rwandan president, a member of the majority Hutu population, was shot down. Everyone on board was killed. Within hours, Hutu extremists seized power and a tidal wave of murder was unleashed against the minority Tutsi population and anyone prepared to defend them. The army came for Prime Minister Agafe Uwilingiyimana. I'm very sorry for not pronouncing that first night. As gunfire rang out, her 5 children, the youngest just 3, were bundled to a chain-link fence to be hidden in a neighbor's house. The children were cowering in the brick-built bungalow, occasionally peeping out the window when they spotted soldiers looking for their parents. There was more gunfire, said Marie Christine, the Prime Minister's daughter, who was 15 at the time. Then we heard the soldiers scream for joy, and after that there was nothing but an eerie silence. Agafe Uwilingiyimana was a moderate Hutu, not a Tutsi, but she was killed because she was ready to share power with them. Had the killers found the children, they would have been slaughtered too. Hours later, when UN soldiers arrived to pick up UN aid workers from the compound behind the Prime Minister's residence, they discovered Marie Christiane and her brothers still hiding in the bungalow. A fierce argument broke out about what to do with the children. It was not clear that the UN soldiers were authorized to move them, says Adam Adaf, one of the aid workers, but on humanitarian grounds, we definitely could not leave them there. It was extremely dangerous to travel anywhere. Roadblocks manned by Hutu killers had already appeared. The armored personnel carriers, which were supposed to have taken UN aid workers to safety, had not shown up. In the end, Daf says it was decided that Captain Mbaye, an unarmed military observer, would take the children in his unarmored car to the relative safety of the nearby UN guarded hotel, the Mille Collines. He decided to load the kids up, says General Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian commander of the small and poorly equipped UN force. He hid them under a tarpaulin and just drove like stink. The gutsiness of that. There are no limits to describe how gutsy. It's Victoria Cross type action. They were the first of many people Mbaye took to the hotel, this Mille Collines, an unremarkable edifice of glass and concrete set on a hill overlooking the capital Kigali, but one of the few sanctuaries for Tutsis in the city. Captain Mbaye Diagne was in his mid-30s from a small village in northern Senegal and a man of immense charm. Tall, gap-toothed and easygoing in aviator sunglasses, his humor people put evil at ease, even one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The first bloody days of the genocide felt like pandemonium. There was hot lead flying in all directions and bodies lying, sometimes piled up on other sides of the roads. The terrifying roadblocks were mainly manned by the Hutu Interahamwe militia. The word means those who work together, and the work was killing Tutsis with machetes, knives and sticks. I saw one man attack another in the head with a screwdriver. Radio stations urged demands calling for the death of Tutsi, quote-unquote, cockroaches. The shooting down of the president's plane had rekindled a civil war between the government army and the rebel forces of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which had been briefly on hold following a tentative peace deal. Led by Tutsi Paul Kagame, the RPF was advancing on the capital, saying it would stop the massacre. In between the two sides was the beleaguered UN force. Its vehicles were sometimes attacked by Hutus, especially if the militia fought their Tutsis inside them. Within the first 48 hours, a lot of the unarmed military observers like Mbaye, especially those outside the capital, disappeared. It took us nearly a month to find some who had gone to different countries, said Dallaire. Some ended up in Nairobi before we knew where they were. With virtually no one to defend them, tens of thousands of Tutsis sought refuge in churches, but even here they were not safe. One of them, Consil Mukamwezi, went with her husband and children to St. Famille Church, a large religious compound in the center of Kigali. She remembers her time there with digital clarity. I just bought some laundry soap from a store where a priest in military uniform came up to me, she said. He had 4 militiamen with him and he was armed with a Kalashnikov rifle, a pistol and grenades. The priest accused me of being a collaborator with rebels. He pointed his Kalashnikov at me like this, he says, picking up a stick from the ground and holding it up like a rifle and says he was going to fire. Incredibly, though it may seem, some Hutu clergy were collaborating in the genocide and some were even taking part. One of Mbaye's jobs was to be the eyes and ears of the UN mission, and he made it his business to check occasionally on the people sheltering at Saint Famille. He knew Conceal by sight because before the genocide she had worked at the office of the national telephone company Rwanda Tel, where he paid his phone bills. And by coincidence he happened to walk into the church compound at her moment of need. Captain Mbaye ran over and stood right between the priest and I. His Conceal, he shouted, "Why are you killing this woman? You must not do this, because if you do, the whole world will know." The priest backed down. There was no large-scale killings inside the Saint Famille compound, partly a result of the efforts of Mbaye and the other UN peacekeepers, although plenty took place just outside. In many churches where people had taken sanctuary, soldiers and militiamen broke in and massacred them in the pews. Other desperate Rwandans attempted to take advantage of rescue operations launched for the country's expat community. Ansila Mukangira, a Rwanda working for a German aid agency, made her way to the American club in the mistaken belief that the Americans would give her a place in one of the vehicles due to leave the country. I went in to register for the convoy, she tells me, outside the old club, which is today a Chinese restaurant. But they said no Rwandans were allowed and told me to leave. Ansila was standing crying on the pavement outside when Mbaye approached her. And this is for people who keep talking about all these alliances with these white nations. I'm willing to bet that there was probably space on them, but they just said no. It reminds me of what happened in Ukraine, where all the black citizens were forced off trains and buses to make way for Ukrainians, and they were left to their own devices and to fend for themselves. And just to go on, there was a scene from Ukraine where a black man was sheltering in a police station from a white neo-Nazi militia, and he was begging them for help, and they kicked him out. Things do not change. She told him she had been kicked out. He was appalled and could barely believe it, she says, but then offered to help her himself. Mbaye was shocked by the behavior of the Wazungu whites, says Andre Gichao, a French academic staying at the Mille Collines Hotel who got to know Mbaye well in the first few days of the genocide. French, Belgian, and Italian troops were flying into Kigali, but only to save their own nationals. For a man who was a UN soldier, this evacuation of Europeans by European soldiers was an absolute scandal. Because if you had put the French and Belgian soldiers alongside the United Nations troops, it would have been perfectly possible to control the army and militia who were directly involved in the massacres. There was no coordination, and Mbaye was definitely deeply horrified by this. In fact, there was little coordination even within the UN system. While officers like Mbaye the black officers were bravely protecting those they could. UN bosses in New York were still arguing how, or even if, to support them. Soon after hostilities began, they actually reduced the number of UN troops on the ground from 2,500 to less than 300. The US, meanwhile, was determined to avoid putting boots on the ground. It was just 6 months after the humiliation of its forces in Somalia when 18 US Rangers were killed in an incident which became known as Black Hawk Down. So Mbaye drove Ansila Mukangira to the Hotel des Mille Collines past the militia men who were waiting at the gate to kill the Tutsis inside. He saw me reading my Bible, Ansila remembers. He said I should pray for my country as awful things were happening. The day he saved my life, I got to know Mbaye a little myself. Soldiers are normally wary of journalists, but in this, as in other ways, he was different. One day we drove together in his white UN car to gather information about an orphanage in a suburb of the city called Nyamirambo, where it was believed several hundred vulnerable children might be hiding. On our way there, we stopped at a militia roadblock. One of the militiamen walked over to the car and leaned through the window holding a Chinese stick grenade. It looked like an old-fashioned sink plunger, but instead of having a rubber sucker on the end of a stout stick, it had a bomb. He waved at me. "Who's this Belgian?" he asked menacingly. The militia considered Belgians, the former colonial power in Rwanda, to be their enemy. They had recently killed 10 Belgian soldiers who were part of the UN force, calculating that this would make the entire Belgian UN contingent leave Rwanda, which it did. I was terrified I was about to be killed, but Mbaye looked at the man, smiled, and cracked a joke. "I'm the old Belgian in this car, see," he said, pinching some of the jet black Senegalese on his arm. "Black Belgian." The joke broke the tension of the moment. Mbaye then ordered him out of the way. The militiamen instinctively obeyed, and we drove on. He loved joking with people. He loved talking, says one of his former comrades in the UN mission, Babacar Faye, now a colonel in the Senegalese army. He used his sense of humor to talk his way through the roadblocks. Mbaye was a devout Muslim, but he carried alcohol in his UN 4x4 to buy the lives of people he was taking through the deadly checkpoints. In his car, he would often have cases of beer, bottles of whiskey, and lots of packets of cigarettes, he says, Vaye. And he always had wads of cash. I once saw a list of names on a scrap of paper that had fallen out of his pocket. It was a list of first names, Pierre, Marie, with sums of money written next to them, $10, $50, and so on. These were his records, the amount he had paid, often on someone else's behalf, to get people through the checkpoints. I mean, this guy is a bit like, is like Schindler's List. He's using his own money, or at least without a hope of ever getting paid back, to save these people's lives. They would have been killed if not for him. He sometimes even gave away his military food rations, and when his colleagues found out, they noted theirs to add to the valuable stash on the back seat of his car. When he was stopped at these roadblocks, the militiamen would say, "Boss, I'm hungry," or "Boss, I'm thirsty." So he'd give them a cigarette, or if it was one of the militia chiefs, he'd give a beer or whiskey, says Faye. This allowed him to go anywhere without making the militiamen too angry. And that's how he saved people the militia wanted to kill. 5 or 6 people in his car at a time. MashaAllah, MashaAllah. May Allah grant him Jannat. Ameen. As time went on, the war split Kigali into 2 zones. One controlled by the government, the other by the RPF. The Hotel des Mille Collines was in the government control zone, right next to a barracks where some of the militia leaders were based. But thanks to his UN armed guards, many Tutsis and moderate Hutsus did what they could to get inside. Most had to have money or contacts. Prime Minister's children were smuggled out of the hotel after a few days, hidden under suitcases in the back of a UN vehicle. They were taken to the airport and flown to safety, still dressed in the pajamas they were wearing when they fled their home. But more and more people arrived at the hotel and conditions steadily worsened. Water supplies were cut off, forcing those sheltering there to drink water from the swimming pool. At first they would boil it, but after the power was cut too, they couldn't even do that. On one occasion, Mbaye and other UN officers tried to organize a convoy of UN trucks from the Mille Collines to the airport. Dr. Odette Nihiramilimo, I'm very sorry if I'm not pronouncing that, was on one of the lorries with her family while Mbaye was in the lead vehicles. The convoy made it out of the hotel gates, but it only got a few hundred meters down the road before it was stopped by a crowd of militiamen. A government propaganda radio system had got hold of a list of the people in the lorries and was reading it out on air, whipping the militia into a frenzy. They were trying to pull us off the lorries, recalls Dr. Nihiramilimo, shouting, "Kill the cockroaches!" Then Captain Mbaye ran up and he stood between the lorry and the militiaman, holding his arms out wide. He shouted, "You cannot kill these people. They are my responsibility. I will not allow you to harm them. You'll have to kill me first." Truly a hero, putting his life on the line when they could easily have killed him, but he stood firm. Eventually, Mbaye, along with other Senegalese officers, dissuaded the militia from killing the people in the convoy. But the crowd of militiamen was too big to drive through, so they had to turn the convoy back to the hotel. They had not been able to get to the airport and out of the country, but they were alive. Back at the Mille Collines, while the doctors was giving first aid to passengers who had been dragged from the vehicles and attacked, Mbaye came up to her. He seemed shocked. Dr. Nihiramilimo says, he was saying, "They almost killed you, they really wanted to do it." And he was upset. He was almost crying. What really struck me was that he was seen far more worried about us than he had been about himself. He was a hero. Indeed, he was. That's what a hero does. He doesn't think about his own safety. He runs into the danger before thinking about himself, if he ever does. And this guy had a family. He could have just gone on a plane back to Senegal like so many of the Europeans did to Belgium or America or France, but he refused. He didn't think about those back home. He thought about the people right in front of him who needed his help. MashaAllah. Dr. Nihiramilimo and Ansila Mukangira eventually left the hotel in later convoys. The UN organized swaps with Tutsis trapped on one side of the front line, exchanged for Hutus stranded on the other. In this way, thousands were saved. A final roadblock. We will never know exactly how many people owed their lives to Mbaye. His old friend Colonel Faye put it at 400 or 500 minimum. He believes all of the people in the hotel there, Miss Colleen, would have been killed had not been for Mbaye's pivotal role in defending it. An official estimate by the State Department in Washington, which in 2011 honored Mbaye with a Tribute to Persons of Courage certificate, says the figure is as many as 600. But the American Fulbright scholar Richard Siegler, who lives in Rwanda and plans to publish a book on Mbaye, thinks the correct figure may be 1,000 or more. The full extent of Captain Mbaye's actions has yet to be recognized, because those who saw him act only saw a small part of what he was doing. When you put everything he did together, it becomes clear that this was one of the great moral acts of our times. It would be wrong to suggest that Mbaye was the only one to have saved lives in Rwanda in 1994. There were countless cases of extreme bravery by Rwandans themselves. But in all the years since the genocide, researchers have pored over the details of what happened, and none has found anyone involved in as many rescues as Captain Mbaye Diagne. I'm very sorry for not pronouncing that right. His luck finally ran out on the morning of 31st of May 1994. By this time, the RPF had the upper hand, but the government forces were making a last stand in central Kigali. Almost every day there were big battles in the city, fights so intense that the sounds of individual guns firing merged together to make a deafening noise like rolling thunder. It was on one of these days that Mbaye was asked to take an important written message from the head of the government army, Augustin Bizimungu, to the UN commander Romeo Dallaire, who was based in the zone now held by the RPF. Mbaye would have to leave the government control sector by driving through a government army checkpoint. He stopped at the checkpoint and the mortar round exploded in the road a short distance from his car. Shrapnel tore through the bodywork. Mbaye was hit and died instantly. Well, at the very least, he did not suffer. It was a very, very difficult day, says Dallaire, who is now a senator in the Canadian Parliament. There were so many, but it stood out because we lost one of those shining lights, one of these beacon-type guys who influences others. Mbaye was part of a small group who had been willing to risk their lives to save others, says Dallaire. He had a sense of humanity that went well beyond orders, well beyond any mandate. He moved at least half a pace faster than everybody else, and he'd been about to go home. And on this article, it says Mbaye and his wife Yassine, and alhamdulillah, from the photo I can see, when you look at the article, she seems very beautiful. And he had been only about to go home. There are only 12 days left before my part in the mission ends, he had told his wife Yassine on the phone 3 days before he was killed. They know I will be back in Senegal, so you must pray for us. In that last call home to Dakar, he talked a lot about death. That really upset me, says Yassine. He never used to talk like that before. I think the things he saw over there deeply affected him. Their 2 children, a boy, Cheikh, and girl, Kumba, were just 2 and 4 years old when their father died. It would be 2 years before Yassine could bring herself to tell them the truth. Daddy will be home when his mission ends, she would tell them. I would say this, let us have a moment to remember all the black servicemen, not just those who have served in European armies, but those who have served all over the world, fighting and dying to defend others. Sometimes people who did not appreciate their sacrifices or honor them, but we remember them. They live on in our collective memory. Yes, it was hard, but they would not have understood, she says. It was the right thing to do, to protect them from it until they could understand. The daughter of the assassinated Prime Minister, Marie-Christine Umahosa, is now married with 2 children of her own. She and her 2 brothers were flown to France, but the country who provided a home for the wife and family of the murdered president rejected the children of the murdered Prime Minister. Instead, they ended up as refugees in Switzerland. Marie-Christine lives in Lausanne, where she works as a psychiatrist nurse. She had never spoken publicly about the events of 1994 before, but she told me her chilling tale with great poise and dignity. She seems to be able to put a tragic part of her life to one side and move on. When I agreed to speak to you, I did in part so I could pay tribute to the memory of Captain Mbaye, she said. He was a good person. I owe him my life. If he hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here now. I heard about Mbaye's death after noticing an unusual amount of chatter on the UN walkie-talkie network. I saw soldiers talking about a serious incident at a government roadblock in which a UN military observer may have been killed. Oh God, I hope it's not Mbaye, says a UN aid worker. But he was in denial. He knew it was Mbaye. I rushed to the roadblock with a Canadian UN officer who also knew but couldn't bring himself to say it. When I found the car, the body has been taken out. There was blood on the seat and in the footwell. The next day, when his body was being taken to a plane at Kigali airport for repatriation to Senegal, there was no coffin available. The UN mission was operating on such a shoestring and had been so abandoned by the rest of the world that Mbaye was wrapped in a large piece of the blue plastic sheeting as the UN normally uses for sheltering refugees. A UN flag was placed on top. Just before the body was loaded, one of the other Senegalese military observers, Captain Samba Tor, approached me. I am a soldier, Captain Tor said, but you are a journalist. You must tell the story of Captain Mbaye Diagne. Then Captain Tor and I both broke down in tears. It's okay. We will remember Captain Diagne. His sacrifice was not in vain, and he was a brave, moral, and courageous man who sacrificed his life for the good of others. And we recognize this shining light during the Mafa, during the dark days of 1994. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.